There have been thousands of books about Marxism, but almost all have been written by academics and zealots for whom it is near blasphemy to treat him, Karl Marx, as a figure of flesh and blood. But the reality is that one cannot separate Marxism the ideology from Marx the man. And today, we're going to find out who this man really was. Karl Marx came from a highly religious background. His grandfather on his mother's side had been the rabbi of the city of Nijmegen, although one account describes him as a merchant, money changer and collector of lottery funds. And an ancestor on his father's side had been the rabbi of Trier in the 1700s. Other family members were rabbis too, including his grandfather on his father's side, who had been the rabbi of Saarlouis, which is where his father was born. So Karl Marx was ethically Jewish, even if his father, Herschel Marx, had converted to Lutheran Christianity prior to Karl Marx's birth, becoming Heinrich Marx, a patriot of the Prussian state. Despite converting to Christianity, Karl Marx's father wasn't super strict with his religion. He did believe in God, but seems to have only converted to Christianity because he wanted a government job, and the Prussian state had banned Jews from such a career. Regardless, Karl Marx himself was baptized by the Lutheran Church, and though it's clear Karl had a reasonable amount of knowledge on the Jewish faith, he wasn't religiously Jewish. Karl Marx himself never practiced Judaism, and in fact he was anti-Jewish, something we'll come back to discuss later. Heinrich could never have become a lawyer but for the effects of the French Revolution. He could never have acquired his legal qualification but for the educational initiatives of Napoleon. And he could not have remained a lawyer except by accommodating himself to the increasingly restrictive Prussian policy towards the Jews after 1815. These momentous events also did much to shape the young Karl's conception of the world, his relationship with his parents, and his generally negative attitude towards his family's Jewish past. This is incredibly important. Karl Marx hated his origins. He despised his Jewish ancestry, and as we'll see shortly, rebelled against his parents, which led to a rebellion against society in general. Self-shame and self-hatred were there right from the beginning, and his philosophy, his ideology, comes from these origins. It's there throughout his works. It deeply affected his family, and it warps the worldview of his followers to this day, whether they're conscious of it or not. But why would Marx be ashamed of his Jewish origins? Jews were treated as members of a separate nation exterior to the states concerned. They were thus restricted to certain quarters of cities, debarred from many occupations, and made subject to a discriminatory tax, justified as a form of protection money levied on the local Jewish community as a whole and divided out between them. Historically, Jews were ostracized from Christian society due to religious and ethnic reasons, meaning that they couldn't own land in Christian Europe. They were, therefore, forced to live in towns and cities, which in English, towns and cities were called boroughs, which is where we get the word bourgeoisie from, which is the French word for townfolk. Unable to get a job in a predominantly Christian and agrarian society, they turned to usury, which is the lending of money and charging interest. Well, usury was banned by the Christian Pope in the Dark Ages. Thus, due to old-fashioned anti-Semitism, the only people who could be the bourgeoisie, or the money changers, as Karl Marx called them, were the Jews. Many believed that the Jews were the bourgeoisie, and that capitalism came from the Jews. That's why the propaganda of anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism look exactly the same, because they are the same. Anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism are just two sides of the same coin. That's also why, during Karl Marx's time, not now, but back then, the German word Judentum was commonly used as a synonym for commerce, which again shows the connection between capitalism and Jewishness. But in the aftermath of the French Revolution, which shook up the old order of Europe, many Jews converted from the faith or lost it entirely. like with Karl Marx's father, and their sons and daughters became ashamed of their Jewish and capitalist heritage. Well, Karl Marx was one of them, which is why his ideology is both anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist, because they're two sides of the same coin. Anyway, Heinrich Marx read Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant. We haven't got time to go into a deep dive on these guys today, but it's clear that Heinrich's interest in philosophy had a major impact on Karl Marx, who became a philosopher himself. And Immanuel Kant's philosophy was especially important since it tried to save faith from science, which is why I have Leonard Peikoff's book on the shelf behind me, since he dives deep on this particular philosophy. Kant's ideology is altruist to the bone and directly led to Hegel, whom Karl Marx read during his education, so the influence was there right from the beginning. Karl Marx's mother, Henrietta, was Dutch, and her German grammar and spelling remained poor throughout her life, which may partly explain why she had a problem dealing with Karl Marx. Henrietta was a family-orientated person who gave Karl excessive motherly love, writing letters to her son, telling him to make money instead of, well, nothing. Another reason he didn't like her.
It seems that the fate of the people of Israel are once again being fulfilled in my case, and that my children are to be scattered throughout all the world.
When Marx went to university, she encouraged him to not smoke too much, not to stay up late, to rise early, and to have a weekly scrub with sponge and soap, which suggests that he wasn't even managing to wash that often. And we will see more evidence which confirms this later on. Marx's early life isn't known in detail, but there are snippets. He was born on the 5th of May 1818 in the German town of Trier, which only had a population of 11,000 at the time. Only Karl and 3 sisters survived and lived out most of their lives, with 5 others dying before the age of 24, mostly from consumption. Karl Marx himself also suffered throughout his life from a weak chest, something that will end up being important later on. He may have played on his weak chest at times, but he also used it as an excuse to not work.
Although we cannot work for long and seldom happily with a physical constitution which is not suited to our profession, the thought nevertheless continually arises of sacrificing our well-being to duty, of acting vigorously although we are weak.
Karl Marx was privately educated until he entered high school, where the teachers were mostly liberals. His school was raided in 1832 by the police, who found revolutionary literature, and charged 2 teachers for atheism and materialism. Now, we're going to focus on Karl Marx's personal life today, so I don't really want to go too in-depth on his ideology, except where it impacts his personal life. And materialism does impact his personal life in a profound way, so a little later on I will explain materialism for you, but for now, just remember that Karl Marx's school teachers had given him a philosophy consisting of atheism and materialism. Oh, and also altruism.
Basing himself upon the pure doctrine of God and the immortality of the soul, which he associated with Kant, Karl Marx's headmaster constantly reiterated the idea that the human being must always, first and foremost, work for others. By this means, the path to immortality would be opened up. For man's nature is so constituted that he can attain his own perfection only by working for the perfection, for the good, of his fellow men.
Marx then went to university at Bonn in 1835 when he was 17. He started off studying law, as his father had wished, but ended up drinking heavily and smoking constantly despite the fact he had a bad chest. His mother and father tried to encourage him to eat healthily, stop smoking and drinking, get outside and go for walks, as well as go to bed early so as to rise in the morning. But it was no use. There is evidence that his father especially berated him for his poor behaviour, and he was placed in detention for disturbing the peace after getting drunk and also carrying prohibited weapons in Cologne. He ended up in prison for 24 hours after one particular binge, and also got into a pistol duel with a trained soldier that, unfortunately for the rest of humanity, only ended up wounding the flesh above his left eye.
Heinrich was also worried about his son's attitude towards money. In January 1936, he complained that his son's accounts were disconnected and inconclusive. One expects order, even from a scholar, and especially from a practical lawyer. Heinrich was convinced that it was possible to manage with less. As if we were men of wealth, my heir son disposed in 1 year of almost 700 thalers, contrary to all agreement, contrary to all usage, whereas the richest spend less than 500. Later, I have paid your money order for 160 thalers. In future, I do not want to expect many of the same kind.
I want to emphasise this because, as we'll see, this particular issue plagued his entire life. Karl Marx was always terrible with money. Marx overspent constantly and never once got his own finances in order. So the fact that his father was telling him this at age 18 is very revealing, as it shows that the man who wrote so much about money, saying it was evil and Jewish, was also someone who didn't understand it and never had any. Well, Heinrich assumed that it was the unserious student culture at Bonn that was to blame for his son's poor behaviour and inability to manage his allowance. So Karl Marx's father forced him to transfer to the far more serious University of Berlin, a city whose population was now at 397,000.
2/3 of the estimated 10,000 new workers who poured into the city each year were effectively homeless and forced nightly to hire a sleeping space, Schlafstelle. Most of the city's burgeoning workforce of tailors and shoemakers remained beneath the tax threshold, and according to the socialist journalist Ernst Drunker, which is a very appropriate name for a socialist journalist, 1 in 17 of the city's female population, many of them country migrants and would-be domestic servants, turned to being pros.
Good old YouTube censorship there. And I'm afraid we do have to take the words of a socialist with a grain of salt. So we do have to ask ourselves, why were people flooding into Berlin if conditions were this bad? Why not just stay in the countryside or go to a different town or village? Why was the population growing if conditions were so poor? None of these people can ever explain this, and the reason why is because their ideology and ignorance of history blind them to what was actually happening. There's an article I'll link to in the description which will explain this in full, but here's part of the article here coming from a book called Human Action.
The truth is that economic conditions were highly unsatisfactory on the eve of the Industrial Revolution. The traditional social system was not elastic enough to provide for the needs of a rapidly increasing population. Neither farming nor the guilds had any use for the additional hands. They were virtually outcasts. The apathetic majority of these wretched people lived from the crumbs that fell from the tables of the established castes. In the harvest season, they earned a trifle by occasional help on farms. Other thousands, the boldest and most ruthless of their class, infested the country as vagabonds, beggars, tramps, robbers, and pros. The authorities did not know of any means to cope with these individuals other than the poorhouse and the workhouse. The support the government gave to the popular resentment against the introduction of new inventions and labour-saving devices made things quite hopeless. The factory system developed in a continuous struggle against innumerable obstacles. It had to fight popular prejudice, old established customs, legally binding rules and regulations, the animosity of the authorities, the vested interests of privileged groups, the envy of the guilds. The factories freed the authorities and the ruling landed aristocracy from an embarrassing problem that had grown too large for them. They provided sustenance for the masses of paupers. They emptied the poorhouses, the workhouses, and the prisons. They converted starving beggars into self-supporting breadwinners. The factory owners did not have the power to compel anybody to take a factory job. They could only hire people who were ready to work for the wages offered to them. Low as these wage rates were, they were nonetheless much more than these paupers could earn in any other field open to them. It is a distortion of facts to say that the factories carried off the housewives from the nurseries and the kitchens, and the children from their play. These women had nothing to cook with, and to feed their children. These children were destitute and starving. Their only refuge was the factory. It saved them, in the strict sense of the term, from death by starvation. It is deplorable that such conditions existed. But if one wants to blame those responsible, one must not blame the factory owners who, driven by selfishness of course and not by altruism, did all they could to eradicate the evils. What had caused these evils was the economic order of the pre-capitalistic era. The order of the good old days.
Anyway, it was in Berlin where he fell in love with his future wife, Jenny von Westphalen. It may be pronounced Jenny, but German speakers online don't seem to agree on how this name is pronounced, so I'm just going to stick with Jenny. But as her name suggests, Jenny was from the aristocracy and her father was a baron. They met as children but found each other again as adults, and she left her fiancé, who was a respectable second lieutenant in the army, and became engaged to Karl Marx in 1836. They hid this from their parents for a year, since this was a step down in every respect for the young woman, and while one historian says she fell for his intellect, I've got to ask the question, but is this really the case? Are nerds drowning in women? No, and as someone who was simultaneously dating 4 women at last Christmas, I've only got one now because one's bad enough, I can honestly tell you that women are not attracted to intelligence, they're actually put off by it. But what they are attracted to is loud and obnoxious rebels who fight in pubs and get scars above their left eyes after being in duels. They like thugs who will protect them in a fight, and the reason why is because that's manly behaviour for them. Back in caveman days, it was the biggest stick that brought home the meat. Nowadays it's often the most intellectual person who has the big wallet, and that certainly helps if you play it right, but big wallets only get you so far. As the lyrics to one of the pop songs say, the bad boys are always catching my eye, ooh-ay, ooh-ah. So Jenny fell for Karl Marx because, even as an infant, she described him as having dark eyes, a domineering personality, and being a terrible tyrant to her and others. He was a volatile nonconformist who was unstable and never prosperous. In other words, a bad boy. And that's what was attractive to her. Now, Karl Marx studied philosophy at university, which is where he came across the works of Hegel. Marx devoured Hegel's works and paid tribute to Hegel for bringing him into adulthood. He joined the Young Hegelians, a discussion group that debated Hegel's ideas, and again we'll come back to discuss Hegel shortly when it's more appropriate. But Marx styled himself as a man of destiny, one of Hegel's heroes, which may go some way to explaining why he was so miserable all the time.
Is your heart in accord with your head, your talents? Has it room for the earthly but gentler sentiments, which in this vale of sorrow are so essentially consoling for a man of feeling? And since that heart is obviously animated and governed by a demon not granted to all men, is that demon heavenly or Faustian? Will you ever, and that is not the least painful doubt of my heart, will you ever be capable of truly human, domestic happiness? Will, and this doubt has no less tortured me recently since I have come to love a certain person like my own child, will you ever be capable of imparting happiness to those immediately around you?
Heinrich Marx was disappointed that his son, Karl Marx, had wasted his time on Hegel's philosophy, thinking that it was an ideology devoid of ideas. He thought that Karl should have concentrated on getting his law degree, and then getting a job, in order to earn an income for himself and his wife-to-be. But Karl Marx was neglecting his law studies and was focusing on philosophy, especially Hegel's philosophy, which Heinrich didn't approve of. So Heinrich therefore hurled grievances at his son until Heinrich died on the 10th of May 1838 from tuberculosis.
Karl did not attend the funeral. The journey from Berlin would be too long, he explained, and he had more important things to do.
Things like skipping class and getting into ever-increasing amounts of debt. His father's death meant that he wasn't receiving the regular amounts of money he had been, and he had to beg from his mother, who was herself a widower in the 1800s and unlikely to earn a wage. Yet instead of doing something, like getting a job, Karl Marx spent his days reading, writing, and smoking. His doctoral thesis was on the difference between Democritean and Epicurean philosophy, and because he had fallen out with his tutor, he instead sent his dissertation to the University of Vienna, which had a reputation of awarding degrees without debate or delay. 9 days later, he was awarded a PhD on these two ancient Greek philosophers. I think it's now time to do a brief overview of the philosophies in question, because it explains Karl Marx's passivity when it comes to finding a career. Democritus was an ancient Greek philosopher who theorized that the world was made up of tiny particles that were uncuttable. The Greek word for uncuttable is atomus, and from this we get the philosophical school called the Atomists. They said that everything was made up of these tiny uncuttable particles called atoms, and that they were moving around in the void, bumping into each other, forming groups of particles, etc. In essence, it's as if the atoms were cogs in a machine, and thus everything was mechanical. They developed the laws of mechanics, and the universe was now seen as a giant machine.
Which means, first of all, that nothing ever happens by chance. Everything is determined by the atomic configurations and the various pressures and reactions by mechanical law. It also means, they said, that nothing ever happens for a purpose, or an end, or a goal. Because atoms, or billiard balls if you want to think of that analogy, do not move around in order to get into the side pocket. They move around simply as a result of the forces operating upon them. In other words, the laws of mechanics have no purposes, no goals.
In this mechanical or materialist worldview, humans were seen as machines too. And just like a car needs a human to drive it, so too do you need something to drive you. So, what is powering you? What's making you move? Well, they said, it's the spirit, God. In fact, Marx's dissertation on Democritus and Epicurus is full of mysticism and full of this idea that spirits come from the atoms. So the idea is that the atoms have a spirit in them, which is why they're moving about. If they didn't have a spirit, what could possibly make them move, right? So this was why Marx ended his dissertation saying,
"The vehicle of vitality, the efflorescence in the gardens of the spirit, the foaming of the bubbling goblet of the tiny seeds, out of which the flower of the single flame of the spirit bursts forth."
In essence, he's saying that the atoms contain spirits, and that's where our spirit, our consciousness, comes from. So Marx's materialism is his mysticism. Those claiming that he was an atheist because he was a materialist have failed to recognize that materialism is, by itself, mysticism. And this is where so many people go wrong. They think materialism is non-religious because it believes in a mechanical reality. But if you follow this idea to its logical philosophical conclusion, the end result is that a god must have existed in order to create the spirits in the machine, the ghost in the shell, in the first place. And if God creates the machine, he does so from his non-physical consciousness, which means that the machine world is fake. It's merely a figment of God's imagination. Idealism. Materialism and idealism are two sides of the same coin. They start in different places, but they both come to the same conclusion, that reality is fake and it was created by the mind of God. This is why Epicurus, the other philosopher Karl Marx wrote about, was so strange, because he believed everything in the world is just mechanical, and the laws of mechanics are determining how everything is moving. From the vibrations of the tiniest atoms, we get the particles, which move and clump together to make bigger molecules, which will then move together again and form the cells of our body, which come together to make limbs, and then eventually our entire being. And we ourselves are just part of this giant universal machine. We're not acting from our own free will, just like the atoms have no free will. We're merely acting as the machine has already determined we should act. So, because this is a mechanical, materialistic world, man has no choice in his actions. It's all predetermined beforehand by the machine. And if we have no free will, what's the point of doing anything, since we can't affect the future? Epicurus therefore concluded that we should withdraw from the world. Atoms have no emotion, and neither should we, he said. He said we should just give up and retire from life in order to not be hurt by it. And thus, he sought pleasure by avoiding the pain of trying.
If you want an aphorism that captures the essence of Epicurus's philosophy on this point, it's "nothing ventured, nothing lost," or "better safe than sorry." Wall yourself off from reality, and then it can't hurt you.
Epicurus therefore built himself a sheltered garden in which he retired. He then ate a simple diet, spoke with a few chosen friends, and let the world outside the garden go to ruin. In essence, he built a Garden of Eden. He thought that the greatest happiness is the absence of strong emotions and not taking action, meaning that happiness was a negative emotion for Epicurus. It is the state of not being hurt, which sounds like safety, but is actually misery.
Hence, the greatest happiness is absence of strong emotions, and therefore cessation of action.
And now it makes sense why Karl Marx did the exact same thing. Marx avoided work, avoided life, he was inimical to it, because he was mimicking Epicurus. There's also a clear rejection of his father and parental issues, but all this combined into the philosophy he had, which turned him into the lazy and miserable communist that he was.
Now, in his dissertation, Marx says that the immediate realization of philosophy is, in its deepest essence, afflicted with contradictions. He hadn't yet discovered Hegel, but it's obvious why he soon fell for him, since Hegel was the master of contradictions.
I have an entire video on Hegel and his idiobabble, but in short, Hegel was an idealist. Idealism is the idea that everything is created by the mind of God, the ideal. But Hegel was what's known as a dialectical idealist. The dialectic is best understood as a transcendence. It's based on the Christian Trinity of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, but it's all about combining opposites. So we have 3 points on a triangle. The first point, the opposing second point, and the higher third point. Hegel didn't use this terminology, but is commonly referred to as the triad of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. When you bash the first two together, you get something else. So let's give an example. Man and woman equals child. Or another, yellow and blue equals green. Hegel said that this change, or Aufheben, results in a synthesis of the opposites. The two opposites become reconciled. And thus contradictions, he said, are good. But what are we doing when we do the dialectic? We are reconciling the two opposites into a new third position. Then we have a new third position, which will also have an opposite. And this then gets reconciled again into a new third position. And so on until we, up and up until we get to God. Therefore, using the dialectic, we can transcend this fake material reality that we're all trapped in. So in the most basic language that I can come up with, so that everyone can understand, The idea of dialectical idealism is defined as the transcendence of a fate reality to get to God. Marx took Hegel, but replaced the Hegelian idealism with materialism. Marx's philosophy is known as dialectical materialism, which people have said is completely different to Hegel. And while Marx did say in Das Kapital that his philosophy was opposite to Hegel's idea, in practical terms, it wasn't. What did we say before? Material reality is created by the mind of God. It's powered by God, and therefore is also idealism. So materialism and idealism are two sides of the same coin. Marx comes at it from a different angle, but ultimately gets to the same conclusion, that we must transcend this fake reality in order to get to God. And that's what Marx's dialectical materialism actually means, the transcendence of a fake material reality.
My dialectic method is not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the life process of the human brain, i.e. the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea he even transforms into an independent subject, is the Demiurgos of the real world. And the real world is only the external, phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. Ah yes, because everybody listening to this knows exactly what you just said. It was perfectly clear, and I won't have to explain this at all. What's that? 99% of the population did not understand this at all because Karl Marx is deliberately distorting the language in order to hide the religion he's in? Oh, okay, well, I better explain it then. So, first off, we have the Christian God. According to the Hermeticists, God created the material world as a prison for the soul of man. We are trapped here, imprisoned by a false materialistic God. And according to the Hermeticists, the true God is immaterial, and they call him the Demiurgos. We need to overcome the material God in order to get to the true God that lies in the immaterial plane. So, let's go through that again a bit slower. The ideal, which is the Christian God, is nothing else than the material world. So, God is the world, reflected by the human mind. So, the world, which is also God, is merely a reflection on the human mind. If there is no human mind, there is no reflection. There is no world. There is no God. Because the world is merely a reflection on the human mind. The world and God, therefore, aren't real. They're just what the mind make them out to be. So this is evidence of this material world being the fake prison for the soul of man. But Karl Marx's Dialectical Materialism says we can overcome and transcend the fake material world, which is also God, and get to the true God above and beyond the fake God, which is the Demiurgos. This is the exact same conclusion Hegel had. It's just that he's going about it in a different way.
This is why, despite calling himself a materialist, Marx hated reality. Marx despised the free market, money and physical possessions, classifying these as little more than materialistic things. But material is fake, right? It's merely a reflection of the human mind. Therefore, he said, we need to live on a more spiritual existence. This is why many socialists and third positionists will chastise people like me, saying things like, you're just a believer in base materialism. We're existing on a higher spiritual level. That's where that's coming from. Their failure to do anything in life is dismissed by their claim that they're operating on some higher spiritual plane. Of course, they're not, in reality, and I'm not a materialist either. Reality is objective, not material. The world is not reflected from our minds, we are part of the world, and physical possessions are a requirement for our continued existence. But we actually see this disconnect in Karl's and Jenny's letters to each other. He was constantly declaring his love to her, writing entire books of soppy and often disturbing poetry to her, and just being a big sissy drip. Somehow, she wasn't completely put off by this, but she did complain about it.
Darling, thou hast drunk of poison, and now thou must depart with me. Now the night has fallen, there is no longer any day. He pressed her violently to his heart, death on her breath and breast. She was pierced by deeper pain, and her eyes were closed forever. Wow, so romantic. Jenny was not altogether reassured by the beautiful, touching, passionate love, the indescribably beautiful things you say about it, the inspiring creations of your imagination. She was concerned about the permanence of such love. That is why I am not so wholly thankful for, so wholly enchanted by your love, as it really deserves. That is why I often remind you of external matters of life and reality, instead of clinging wholly, as you can do so well, to the world of love, to absorption in it, and to a higher, dearer spiritual unity with you, and in it forgetting everything else, finding solace and happiness in that alone.
Marx truly was living in the spiritual world of nothing. However, there's another, perhaps more simpler way of understanding what the dialectic is actually about, and this is how it manifests itself in practice.
In Marxism, there are always two ways, at least, of looking at anything and everything, and the reconciliation of these views are attained only by dialectic artificialities. The commonest device is to use, according to the needs of the moment, a word to which more than one meaning may be attached. With these words, which at the same time serve as political slogans to hypnotize the mass psyche, a cult suggestive of fetishism is carried on. The Marxist dialectic is essentially word fetishism. Every article of the faith is embodied in a word fetish, whose double or even multiple meaning makes it possible to unite incompatible ideas and demands. Revolution is one of these words. By industrial revolution, Marxism means the gradual transformation of the pre-capitalistic way of production into the capitalist way of production. Revolution here means the same as development, and the contrast between the terms evolution and revolution is almost extinguished. But when Marx calls the workers' movement a revolutionary movement and says that the working class is the only true revolutionary class, he is using the term in the sense that suggests barricades and street fights.
Remember before when I explained that the Jews were the bourgeoisie? That's another example of a word that means something else. The word bourgeoisie has two meanings. It's dialectic, because when the true Marxist intellectuals use the term, they're referring to the Jews. But you think they're referring to the middle class. And class itself actually means race. And perhaps most importantly, the term socialism is itself dialectic. It has multiple meanings. It simultaneously means state control and non-state control. It means total control of the means of production, totalitarianism, whilst also meaning democracy. The word democracy also means both freedom and totalitarianism. And I'm sure you can think of many other terms that the socialist comes out with that have multiple meanings. But it's all done to hide their true intentions and to hopefully sucker people into their religion. And as I've said many times now, it's all a trick.
Considering Marx's narcissistic personality, uncompassionate behaviour, character assassination against his own devotees, ideological dishonesty, and obsession with twisting his words around to suit his own agendas, Marxism agitated for a fallacious metaphysical vision of the world. In essence, Marxism became a paradox masquerading as a revolved contradiction. Marx's dedicated sidekick, Engels, turned his contemptuous scorn towards the proletariat. And I'll just interject to say that the word proletariat is dialectic. It has multiple meanings too, but doesn't truly mean the working people. In private, he had nothing but contempt and ridicule for workers. He referred to the proletariat as those censorship donkeys, or those stupid workers who believed everything. In another letter to Marx, he questioned the workers' intelligence, accusing them of bad character and finding their drowsiness and petty jealousy disgusting. The point is to say that you cannot take the rhetoric at face value. You have to understand that the words they're using are not the same as those in the dictionary. We have to question what they're saying and peer behind the curtain to figure out exactly what their true meanings are. And we'll see some more of this as we go forward. After getting his degree, Karl Marx did nothing. Rather than get a job, he wandered around aimlessly between Bonn, Trier and Cologne, wondering what to do next. His father had wanted him to become a lawyer, but he had chosen to become a philosopher, and that meant doing nothing. There's no career path for a philosopher. So relations with his mother soured after his father's death, mainly thanks to Karl's abandonment of his family, and she refused to give him his inheritance. And I want to make one thing clear. Karl Marx didn't get a degree in economics. He was a philosopher, not an economist. George Young viewed Marx not as a political revolutionary, but a theological, philosophical revolutionary who was attempting to overthrow the entire social system, not just an economic system. And I absolutely agree, it's a religious philosophical system that ultimately has its origins right back in the ancient Greek Orthics, if not beyond. But that's a topic I've talked about previously, so I won't go there today. So, in July 1841, Karl Marx went to stay with Bruno Bauer in Bonn, and spent the summer doing nothing but smoking, getting drunk, laughing in church, riding into towns on the backs of donkeys pretending to be Jesus, and just generally avoiding work at all costs. For that Easter season 1842, Bruno and Karl went to the nearby village of Godesberg, which was a favourite excursion site from Bonn, rented donkeys and rode them through the village in what was a direct and deliberate parodying of the entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem. Their supporters to this day surely get a good chuckle out of the display. It was probably the kind of thing that admiring Marx biographer Francis Wien had in mind when he wrote about it with a smile. In late 1842, Marx finally got a job at the Rheinische Zeitung, a newspaper set up by several of his friends and funded by bourgeois capitalist investors, proving once again that capitalism and socialism are two sides of the same coin. But it's clear that Marx had other priorities. One night, Karl Marx and the journalist Karl Heinzen went out drinking and wandered home after several bottles of wine. As soon as I was in the house, he shut the doors, hid the key, and jeered comically at me that I was his prisoner. He asked me to follow him up into his study. On arrival, I sat myself down on the sofa to see what on earth this marvellous crank would get up to. He came over to me, gave me to understand that he had me in his power, and, with a malice that recalled an imp rather than the intended devil, he began to attack me with threats and cuffs. I begged him to spare me that sort of thing, because it went against the grain to pay him back in the same coin. When he did not stop, I gave him a serious warning that I would deal with him in a way which he would certainly feel. And when that too did no good, I saw myself compelled to dispatch him into the corner of the room. When he got up, I said that I found his personality boring, and asked him to open the door. Now it was his turn to be triumphant. "Go home then, strong man," he mocked, and added a most comical smirk. It was as though he was chanting the words from Faust, "There is one imprisoned inside." At least, the sentiment was similar, although his unsuccessful imitation of Mephistopheles made the situation comic in the extreme. In the end, I warned him that if he would not open the door for me, then I would get it open myself and he would have to pay for the damage. Since he only answered with mocking sneers, I went down, tore the front door off its lock, and called out to him from the street that he should shut the house up to prevent the entry of thieves. Dumb with amazement that I had escaped from his spell, he leaned out of the window and goggled at me with his small eyes, like a wet goblin.
It's no wonder, a few years later, that Karl Marx would denounce Karl Eisen as a Philistine and condemn him as an egoist, with one of his tirades against him going on for nearly 30 pages. Engels called him the most stupid person of the century and threatened to box his ears. Eisen would respond saying that Karl Marx was a sophist, a liar, and said he was always dressed in dirty linen. Which is interesting, we'll certainly hear more about that later. But it's clear from all this that Marx was a bully and a very deranged person. The doting Francis Wien scoffs at the idea of Marx being anything other than a saint, echoing the thoughts of socialists around the world. But from this point onwards, Karl Marx's life goes downhill very rapidly.
Marx was appointed as the editor of the newspaper, which he then became a tyrant over. But this is what one biographer says about it. To describe these writings as journalism is somewhat misleading. Nearly all the articles were long, some exceedingly so. Both accounts of the proceedings of the estates were between 40 and 50 pages long. They were not forms of investigative reporting aimed at uncovering the existence of concealed facts, and were almost exclusively concerned with the principle of press freedom, an embodiment of the idea, in contrast to censorship, the world outlook of semblance.
Well, the obsession with press freedom was due to the fact that they were becoming more and more radicalised as they battled the government with words. That was until the Prussian government stepped in and censored the newspaper in 1843 on the request of Tsar Nicholas I of Russia. The reason why was because the newspaper had become anti-Russian. It was German after all. So, at age 24, having only worked a few months so far in his life, assuming journalism counts as work, which is questionable, Karl Marx was once again unemployed. And worse, it had been several years since he had pledged himself to Jenny, and even he was beginning to feel guilty for not having married her yet. Heated arguments then ensued between them, and she had to point out that, unlike men, she couldn't get a job. Which is not true, but she's an aristocrat, so of course she would say that.
It was, as she tried to explain, different for girls. Condemned to passivity by Eve's original sin, they could only wait, hope, suffer, and endure.
Nope, you could in fact get a job as a woman in the 1800s. Most chose not to get one because they decided to be housewives instead, which made sense back then as there was no washing machines or vacuum cleaners, and usually the children needed their mothers with them during these times, but technically she could have got a job prior to becoming a mother, and the reason why she didn't was because, as a toff, work was beneath her. But Marx's pledge to Jenny didn't stop him from falling for Bettina von Arnim, a famous romantic poet who was old enough to be his mother. He even took her back to Trier to meet Jenny, who was obviously not impressed, even though she stuck with him. And historian Francis Wien claims this was because Jenny was intimidated by Marx's intellect, an intellect attracted to other thinkers, not dumb ladies like Jenny. But that's clearly not the case. The fact is that a man who's wanted by other women is seen as attractive by women. This is the concept of pre-selection.
To marry a Jew was shocking enough, but to marry a jobless, penniless Jew who had already achieved national notoriety was quite intolerable. Her reactionary half-brother, Ferdinand, the head of the family since their father's death, did his utmost to prevent the union, warning that Marx was a ne'er-do-well who would bring disgrace on the entire tribe of von Westphalens.
So, the 29-year-old Jenny, accompanied by her mother, fled from Trier to be with the 25-year-old Marx, whom she married on the 19th of June 1843. They received a large box of cash from Jenny's mother, which was intended to be used to help them in the first few months of their marriage. They opened it for their friends, and it was all gone within the week, starting as they wished to continue. But in the period of 1843 to 1844, they still had some money coming in from relatives and friends, and Karl Marx managed to secure another job at another newspaper in Paris, population 1 million, the second largest after London. So Karl and Jenny seized the means of reproduction to produce their first child and went on a spending spree.
His wife gave him for his birthday a riding switch costing 100 francs, and the poor devil cannot ride nor has he a horse. Everything he sees he wants to have. A carriage, smart clothes, a flower garden, new furniture from the exhibition, in fact, the moon.
This might explain where all the money was going. He was wasting it. Well, Jenny gave birth to a baby girl on the 1st of May 1844, who was also called Jenny just to make us all confused. But these two newlyweds were in over their heads.
Little Jenny Marx, a baby a few months old, was attacked one day by strong cramps which threatened to kill the child. Karl Marx, his wife, and their faithful helper and friend, Helena de Mutt, were standing around the child in a complete quandary. Then Heinrich Heine arrived, had a look and said the child must have a bath. With his own hands he prepared the bath, put the child in, and saved, so Marx said, little Jenny's life.
Heinrich Heine was another socialist anti-Semite who called all the inhabitants of Hamburg Jews, saying that the city was a city of hagglers. It was from him that Marx got the idea that religion was the opium of the masses. And Jenny was pregnant for a second time. Well, her mother had sent her a maidservant, the 25-year-old Helena de Mutt, who was just mentioned in that quote. Her nickname was Lenchen. And that's right, Karl Marx, the unemployed communist, had a maid and was living on handouts. Worse, this maid didn't get paid by Marx. She was practically an indentured servant for life. In other words, a serf.
Karl, champion of the proletariat, fulminator against low-paid workers, protester against wage exploitation, never paid Lenchen a penny.
And this is because he's a bourgeois lord who's just married an aristocrat. So he is a member of the elite. Well, being a member of the elite, work was beneath him. So when the new newspaper that he was at only ever published one issue and was a financial flop, he became unemployed again. His wife was concerned about their lack of money, especially since the Prussian government demanded that Marx and his anti-establishment friends should be arrested if they ever returned to Germany.
Dearest heart, I am greatly worried about our future. If you can, do set my mind at rest about this. There is too much talk on all sides about a steady income. A steady income was one necessity of life that always eluded Karl Marx, as we're about to see. And as one of the biggest ironies of history, for all his mockery of bourgeois morals and manners, Marx was at heart a supremely bourgeois patriarch.
I think it's worth just pointing out that Paris at this time was an interesting city, simply because it disproves the narrative that the Industrial Revolution and laissez-faire capitalism resulted in squalor and overcrowding. The French Revolution and the subsequent revolutions in 1830 and 1848 weren't due to either of these things, and even one of the Marxist historians has to point this out, despite saying earlier in the book that they were.
Paris was, after London, the second largest city in Europe, with a population of over 1 million. It specialised in the fabrication of quality fashion goods and the supply of specialised services. Its working class population was by far the largest in France, but factory work was almost unknown. Its workers were largely members of skilled trades employed in small workshops. In 1848, 50% worked along or were assisted by a single employee, and only 1 in 10 shops employed more than 10 workers. In the first half of the century, the city's population doubled. Immigrants were drawn to the city by the prospect of higher wages. The migration of artisans had begun in the years after 1815 as a result of the increase of population, the relaxation of guild restrictions, and the consequent overcrowding of German trades.
So, with this in mind, it's a little odd that Marx came to the conclusions he did. He was starting to publish some of his more well-known works, like the manuscripts of 1844, where he declared that the workers became estranged from their work. According to him, wages are determined by a struggle between the capitalist and the worker, and that the worker always loses. The worker is condemned to overwork, early death, and enslavement to capital. And he's writing this in Paris, a city which disproves his own narrative. In reality, when we peer behind the curtain, what he's actually doing here is making excuses for why he himself is not making any money. I don't want to be overworked, have an early death, or be enslaved to capital. His entire philosophy, because it isn't economics, is just an excuse for Karl Marx himself to not take ownership of his own life. It's nothing to do with external factors, it's purely about himself. And these excuses he was coming up with, blaming the system for his own shortcomings, helps him explain to others why he was terrible with his own money. It's not my fault. Why he's massively in debt. It's the greedy capitalists. Why he's lazy. There's no point in working for the man. Why he's rebelling against his father who wanted him to get a career. The division of labour is bad, dude. Shirking his responsibilities with Yenny and the children. Don't you understand that you're oppressed by the system? And declaring that everybody should help society. Give me money and free stuff so I don't have to work. Again, Karl Marx was a new Epicurus, which is why he was so against work. Marx also wrote his essay on the Jewish question, where he rallied against the Jews. Now, his biographers once again come to his defence, saying that he wasn't really anti-Semitic or racist, just anti-religious. In fact, sometimes they're baffled by the use of the anti-Semitic language and try to excuse it as best they can. But, as I explained earlier, he thought that the Jews were the bourgeoisie, and I've got an entire video on this showing that he was anti-Semitic to the core. That's the essence of anti-capitalism. But apologists and adherents to the faith will continue to ignore the reality of this because they're adherents to the faith. I refuse to do that. I stand by what the evidence suggests.
The chimerical nationality of the Jew is the nationality of the merchant, of the man of money in general. Just to point out, the italics are from Marx himself. But again, the merchant, the capitalist, is the Jew. That's what he's saying here. And I know I'll get people trying to come up with excuses, but there's no way around this. Once society has succeeded in abolishing the empirical essence of Judaism, huckstering and its preconditions, the Jew will have become impossible, because his consciousness no longer has an object, because the subjective basis of Judaism, practical need, has been humanized, and because the conflict between man's individual sensuous existence and his species existence has been abolished. The social emancipation of the Jew is the emancipation of society from Judaism.
Don't you notice that he was replying to Bauer? Yes, but not at that point. That's Karl Marx's conclusion to his reply to Bauer. He's not quoting him. Anyway, Marx met Engels during his newspaper editing days, and the two became close friends after this. However, the Prussian king, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, sent a letter to the French king, Louis Philippe, in January 1845, complaining that the newspaper Marx was working for was publishing insults and libels against them. Both agreed that there were too many German philosophers in Paris, so Marx was ordered to leave France. Yenny sold her furniture and linen, and Marx sent a letter to the King of Belgium, the last place on continental Europe that would have him, promising that he wouldn't publish anything in Belgium on current politics.
By the time Marx's wife and daughter joined him, he was already back in the old routine: reading, writing, boozing, scheming. There were long mornings in cafes and even longer nights of card playing and tipsy conversation. For once, even the family finances were in credit. 2 days before leaving Paris, Marx was paid a 1,500 franc advance by a publisher in Darmstadt for his embryonic work on political economy, and a whip around by Engels provided another 1,000 francs to the kitty, mostly from supporters in Germany.
Marx and Engels started writing pieces together, such as The German Ideology, which took them an entire winter to write. In this, and the subsequent Poverty of Philosophy, they outlined historical materialism, which I'm not going to get into here, but it's more mystical nonsense. However, what they also did in this, plus in Anti-Düring, was give a hint at what communism would be. They said that productivity comes from labour, and labour is currently enslaved. So, once we've reached communism, labour becomes free. Men wouldn't be tied to a particular job. There would be no specialists because they would be freed from the means of production. So, as Marx and Engels write,
as long, therefore, as activity is not voluntary, but naturally divided, man's own deed becomes an alien power opposed to him, which enslaves him instead of being controlled by him. For as soon as the division of labour comes into being, each man has a particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him, and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a shepherd, or a critical critic, and must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. Whereas in communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production, and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticise after dinner, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, shepherd, or critic.
And this is literally the only time Marx and Engels suggest what living in a communist society would be like. And it is truly pathetic. As I explained in my video on Lenin, apparently we're all meant to just wander around aimlessly, but somehow things get done. Random people just turn up at nuclear power plants to produce nuclear power, other nobodies get into the pilot seats of passenger planes, start open heart surgeries, or help build bridges even though they're not qualified for those jobs. And they can't even have qualifications, since that would require dedicated and specialised study, which is a division of labour, something Marx and Engels say is a product of capitalism and one of the reasons why it's exploitative. People just wander onto farms to produce food for the sake of it, and people who aren't delivery drivers by profession drive the food around for free, and they somehow know where it needs to go even though there's no mechanism to tell them. We can't predict how many people are going to be in a specific place at a specific time, since there's no free market price mechanism in order to make the necessary economic calculations, and so there's no way to know where to deliver the food or any of the other goods for that matter. Yet somehow it's all just meant to work, and when asked how, without a division of labour, someone would produce a great work of art, they simply responded,
"In a communist society there are no painters, but only people who engage in painting, among other activities."
So there won't ever be a great artist in communism, since there's no dedication to one career. And I don't think he's being honest, so let's look behind the curtain again. Karl Marx doesn't want to get a career. He doesn't want a job. So he's saying he will wander about doing various activities like a lord would do. If you read what he said in the original quote, he says, "It makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow." So it's about him, not us. We'll all be doing those other tasks, and he'll be sat on his backside criticising after dinner or maybe going fishing. This is little Lord Fauntleroy using deceptive language to trick us into falling back into serfdom. It's not a progression, it's a regression back to the good old days. And I think in this we can see Karl Marx's immaturity and lack of purpose. He doesn't want to make the hard decision of choosing a career, locking him into a profession, and then taking responsibility for his life as well as his family. Instead, he wants to remain a child, moving from one frivolous activity to the next, while we all toil in the fields for our master. But Karl Marx's childish dreams aside, Jenny gave birth to Laura Marx on the 26th of September 1845, and in 1846 a Communist Correspondence Committee was formed in Brussels with 18 founding signatories: Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, Jenny Marx and a bunch of others, some of whom were expelled or resigned, leaving them with just 15 members. But some months after this, Jenny gave birth to Edgar Marx in February 1847, and Engels had some bad news. Engels was off to Paris to have some fun, and wouldn't have enough income to send money to Marx.
As the sole provider for an effete wife, 3 small children and a housemaid, Marx could ill afford to go off on a bachelor's bender in gay Paris. He was unemployed and virtually unemployable.
Family finances would soon be a critical problem. But it was at this moment that Marx and Engels, now in the Communist League, started to work on the Communist Manifesto. The original name for this was the Communist Confession of Faith, and the slogan "Workers of the World Unite" was originally going to be "All men are brothers," which should indicate to you that this isn't an economic text, but religious and philosophical scripture. They were commissioned by the Communist League to write their manifesto as soon as possible, and Engels had already given Marx his early drafts. But when Marx returned home in mid-December 1847, he procrastinated and distracted himself with anything other than writing the manifesto itself. On the 24th of January 1848, the Communist League sent him an ultimatum saying that if they didn't receive the manifesto by the 1st of February, measures would have to be taken against him. This snapped Karl Marx into action, and he managed to hit the deadline after working throughout the night. Marx's biographer Jones can't help but gush over Karl Marx and his manifesto. He apparently predicted the future perfectly, saying that this was the first time anyone truly grasped how restless capitalism would destabilize all societies and turn all things, including men, women and children, into objects to be sold. Unlike the slavery of the good old days, eh? Because let's not forget that Karl Marx himself was pro-slavery.
The only thing requiring explanation is the good side of slavery. I do not mean indirect slavery, the slavery of the proletariat. I mean direct slavery, the slavery of the blacks in Suriname, in Brazil, in the southern regions of North America. Direct slavery is as much the pivot upon which our present-day industrialism turns, as are machines, credit, etc. Without slavery there would be no cotton. Without cotton there would be no modern industry. It is slavery which has given value to the colonies. Slavery is, therefore, an economic category of the paramount importance. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive nation, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. You know, I'm just going to read that sentence again. Without slavery, North America, the most progressive nation, back then, with all the slaves, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Just let that sink in for a moment. This sentence suggests that the words progressive and patriarchy do not mean what the rest of us think they mean. Again, they are dialectical, and unfortunately, at this present moment, I'm not entirely certain what the true Marxist meaning of these words truly are. If anyone thinks they do know or has potential suggestions or clues to their real Marxist meaning, please comment below. But obviously this should be a big warning signal to any socialist listening to this. You guys have been tricked. Please understand that. Anyway, let's continue. Only wipe America off the map and you will get anarchy, the complete decay of trade and modern civilization. But to do away with slavery would be to wipe America off the map. Right. Well, I think that's pretty clear. Marx was pro-slavery.
Francis Veen points out that, although people sneer at Marx for having predicted a revolution that never came, in fact, Veen says, revolution did break out within days of the Manifesto's publication. This is somehow meant to be proof that Marx was right, even though capitalism hadn't yet developed. Right? There was no proletariat in 1848. And it's nonsense anyway, because it's been 176 years now since its publication, and despite the fact we've implemented all 10 points of the Communist Manifesto, we apparently still live in a capitalist system. Actually, yeah, maybe Marx is right. Maybe we're living in communism, and that's why we've implemented all 10 points in the Communist Manifesto. That would explain all the YouTube censorship, since it's the communists who control the media. Interestingly, despite advocating that very same month in the Communist Manifesto that inheritance should be abolished, Marx had no problem accepting an inheritance of 6,000 francs from his mother for his father's death in mid-February 1848. According to his wife, Jenny, he immediately started using it to finance the revolutionary movement, arming workers with guns and daggers. But Jones says this is wrong, and others say he just wasted it all on random stuff, but it's irrelevant. We don't need to get into that debate. Either way, the authorities weren't happy with him, as Marx had broken the promise he'd made to King Leopold I of Belgium because he had been publishing political material. He was, therefore, given 24 hours to leave the country, and then the police intervened.
At 1 AM, however, 10 police officers burst into the house and dragged him off to a prison cell at the town hall, where he was locked up with a raving madman who spent much of the night trying to punch him on the nose.
Jenny was also arrested and thrown into a cell with 3 pros who like to accept money from men. Again, can't say that word on YouTube. They were released at 3 PM the next day, which gave them just 2 hours to sell all their possessions and catch a train. Her family's silver and linen were placed in the care of a friend, and under police escort, they were kicked out of the country. They went to Paris, which was currently in the middle of the 1848 revolution, so not the perfect place to raise a family. They therefore went back to Cologne, Germany, where Marx founded the now Rheinische Zeitung, the new newspaper named after the original that he had worked for. Of course, he had lost his Prussian citizenship and was rejected when he requested it be restored, so he was now under threat of expulsion if he didn't play ball. They hoped to secure 30,000 thalers, but only managed 13,000, so Marx used up the last of his inheritance to get the newspaper up and running, which came out on June 1st, 1848. Unlike previously, Marx was completely in control of this newspaper, with Engels calling it a simple dictatorship for Marx. But Marx was so antagonistic to work that he even failed to be a journalistic lord.
He is no journalist and will never become one. He paused for a whole day over a leading article that would take someone else a couple of hours, as though it concerned the handling of a deep philosophical problem. He changes and polishes, and changes the change, and owing to his unremitting thoroughness, can never be ready on time.
At this time, the German states hadn't really got a proletariat as such. It simply hadn't developed yet. And therefore, Marx declared that they needed a bourgeois revolution first, before a proletarian revolution. Therefore, the newspaper tried to simultaneously support the bourgeoisie, while calling out the antagonism between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Francis Veen praises the newspaper for selling 5,000 copies, which was a huge circulation by the standards of the day, but 5,000 really is nothing in the grand scheme of things, and is an indication that socialism really is geared towards the elite.
The paper did not foreground the grievances of workers, and it was also written in a style inaccessible to all, except a propertied and educated bourgeoisie. Because that's whom socialism truly is for, the elite, not the workers. By September 1848, the authorities were cracking down on the rioters and their leaders. Engels had to flee, was caught, and thrown back into France, and the bourgeois shareholders withdrew their support of the newspaper. Then, just to add salt to the wound, lawsuits were brought against Marx, who had made speeches they deemed to be high treason. Meanwhile, Engels seemed to have his mind elsewhere. At every step I found the gayest company, the sweetest grapes, and the prettiest girls. But he got bored by Christmas and returned to Germany in January 1849, just as the revolution was coming to an end. Marx wasn't happy that the much-needed alliance between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat didn't materialise, and therefore the current elites remained in power. Having rifles and 250 bullets in the newspaper's editorial room invited a police prosecution, and the newspaper was shut down. Marx sold the printers, which he personally owned, and the furniture from his house to pay off his outstanding debts, and left Germany once more. Jenny joined Marx in Paris, where he was expelled again in August 1849. So, with nowhere else on continental Europe willing to take these subverters, they sailed to England. After censorshipping her silver in Frankfurt, selling her furniture in Cologne, and being forced to leave Paris, Jenny had arrived in London with 3 children and a 4th expected within 3 months. London was the first city to reach a population of 1 million, and accepted 300,000 immigrants between 1841 and 1851. Including Marx and other political outcasts. Jenny, heavily pregnant, arrived in the city suffering from a cholera epidemic in September 1849, already sick and exhausted with 3 small children. And things only got worse. Heinrich Marx was born on the 5th of November 1849 to the sounds of fireworks celebrating Bonfire Night. This baby was born into chaos. Let me describe for you, as it really was, just one day in our lives. Since wet nurses here are exorbitantly expensive, I was determined to feed my child myself, however frightful the pain in my breast and back. But the poor little angel absorbed with my milk so many anxieties and unspoken sorrows that he was always ailing and in severe pain by day and night. In his pain he suckled so hard that I got a sore on my breast, an open sore. Often blood would spurt into his little trembling mouth. I was sitting thus one day, when suddenly in came our landlady. She demanded the £5 we still owed her, and, since this was not ready to hand, 2 bailiffs entered the house and placed under distraint what little I possessed: beds, linen, clothes, everything, even my poor infant's cradle, and the best of the toys belonging to the girls, who burst into tears. At last a friend came to our aid. We paid, and I hurriedly sold all my beds, so as to settle with the apothecaries, bakers, butchers, and milkmen, who, their fears aroused by the scandal of the bailiffs, had suddenly besieged me with their bills. But even now, Marx didn't apply for any jobs. He had 4 children, a wife and a maid, plus a rent of £6 a month, £72 a year, which was far more than he could afford. Marx tried to set up a newspaper with a stupidly long German name, which he somehow got money to finance, but it only managed 5 issues before failing. It didn't help that Marx decided to use this newspaper to write attacks on the German refugees in London, the only potential readers of this German language newspaper. I mean, that's a bold tactic that maybe I should try. You're all bad people, unless you like this video. The first issue was postponed when Marx fell ill for a fortnight. The typesetter's inability to decipher his scrawl caused further delay. He argued continually with the publisher and distributor, suspecting them of being in league with the censors. The miracle is that it ever appeared at all. I beg you to send, as soon as possible, any money that has come in or comes in from the review. We are in dire need of it."
Despite his family's sufferings, Marx was procrastinating and not really doing much at this time, which resulted in him being called a reactionary by another socialist, August Willich. Arguments ensued, with Willich challenging Marx to a duel. Willich was a good shot and Marx was a chicken, so another socialist decided to fight on Marx's behalf. The two duelists went to Antwerp, where duels were legal, and fired at each other. Willich won, the other guy survived but was wounded, and it was this affair that ended the Communist League in September 1850. Shortly after, in mid-November 1850, Heinrich Marx died suddenly in a fit of convulsions just after his first birthday. Jenny was obviously distraught.
She's in a really dangerous state of excitation and exhaustion.
And, in an ironic twist, the new Prussian Minister of the Interior was Jenny's half-brother, Ferdinand von Westphalen, who had tried to prevent Jenny from marrying Marx 7 years earlier. He was now out for revenge, and in the wake of an assassination attempt on the Prussian king, was sending agents across Europe to track down all the political activists. But despite a Prussian report on a Marxian discussion about killing Queen Victoria being sent to the British authorities, they didn't act upon it. The free market, however, had decided that enough was enough.
One morning, our worthy host refused to serve us our breakfast, and we were forced to look for other lodgings. Marx's landlord evicted him and his family because of communism's founding fathers' revulsion to the idea of an individual providing for himself and his family. A few days later, the Marxes found temporary shelter in the house of a Jewish lace dealer at 64 Dean Street, Soho, where they spent a miserable summer teetering on the edge of destitution. Jenny was pregnant again and constantly ill.
No wonder. Their flat on Dean Street was a 2-room apartment with tattered furniture and fittings with dust covering everything. According to one of the spies sent out to check on them, they lived in absolute squalor, with Marx's papers mixed with children's toys, rags, broken cups, knives, forks and various other objects all over the place. Not only wasn't it clean, but, and this is a quote, "If you sit down, you risk a pair of trousers." It was here, in these putrid conditions, that Marx set up yet another newspaper, while he, his pregnant wife, his children, and his maid all slept in the same bed, which he also didn't wash.
He leads the existence of a real bohemian intellectual. Washing, grooming, and changing his linen are things he does rarely, and he likes to get drunk. Though he is often idle for days on end, he will work day and night with tireless endurance when he has a great deal of work to do. He has no fixed times for going to sleep and waking up. He often stays up all night, and then lies down fully clothed on the sofa at midday and sleeps till evening, untroubled by the comings and goings of the whole world. A complete office has now been set up in our house. 2 or 3 people are writing, others running errands, others scraping pennies together so that the writers may continue to exist and prove the old world of officialdom guilty of the most outrageous scandal. And in between, whiles my 3 merry children sing and whistle, often to be harshly told off by their papa. What a bustle! By August, things were so bad that she had to go to Holland and throw herself at the mercy of Karl's maternal uncle, Lion Philips, a wealthy Dutch businessman, whose eponymous company flourishes to this day, selling all manner of electric products from television sets to pop-up toasters. No. According to online sources, it was actually Lion Philips's grandchildren that founded the Philips Electrics Corporation. So Francis Veen was probably wrong here, but regardless, Lion Philips was a wealthy businessman.
Philips gave her a small present for one of her sons, but no help or money, and Jenny returned empty-handed. Engels bailed them out a little, having been compelled to get a job at his family's firm. And when Engels received an allowance from his father, he then set up a salary for his friend. But no matter how much Engels gave Marx, it was never enough, as he kept on increasing his expenditure. The money just slipped through his hands like water flowing through a sieve. And even now, Karl Marx didn't even try to get a job, and was happy to allow his wife and family to suffer as he begged and borrowed to keep them.
My landlady is very poor. This is the second week she has not been paid, and she is dunning me with dreadful determination.
Oh, don't you know, Karl Marx, that all landladies are extremely rich, which is why they rent out their rooms. Because, they've got so much money that they need more, apparently. Yeah, they're just so greedy. Obvious sarcasm is obvious, except for on the internet, apparently, because some people have never heard of it. And it was at this time that Marx's maid became pregnant. At the same time that his wife was pregnant. And they were both sharing the same bed. Now, the theory goes that the maid's child was somehow Engels' child, not Marx's. But Engels was nowhere near. And it's blatantly obvious from the sources that Marx lied to his wife and everybody else tried to play along to cover for him. Some historians have even speculated that the maid may not have been able to consent to the eloping since she was essentially his slave. And yet, many apologists are still defending Karl Marx. They're defending a potential arist. Again, avoiding the censors. You're telling me that Marx and his maid shared the same bed, rumours were abound, Jenny was pregnant and also really angry at Marx, they decided not to tell the world, and Jenny's friend wrote a letter saying that Freddie looked just like Karl Marx, while Marx was reluctant to tell Engels, who was living in a different city, and Marx's daughter later went through the sources to remove any damning evidence, yet this is somehow Engels' child. No, absolutely not. Engels supposedly took the heat at the time and later admitted who this child's real father was on his deathbed, but at that moment he couldn't speak and only wrote the truth on a tablet for a friend, and the tablet never survived, and we only have a typewritten copy which were probably garbled memories of what Engels may or may not have actually written.
Freddie was put out to nurse and subsequently brought up in East London by working class foster parents. Okay, so if it truly was Engels' child, why not send Freddie to stay with him? Why did Engels not care at all about his own child? And the answer is because it's nonsense. The child was clearly Karl Marx's. Whatever the tensions within the household, surviving accounts also suggest a strong and happy family life. Really?
The 37-year-old Jenny delivered her child, a girl called Franziska, while she was noticeably depressed. Jenny was living in squalor, sharing a bed with a maid that her husband had impregnated and then lied about, and her new child was also ill from the start. They were that poor that they couldn't afford a cradle for the newborn. Yet even now, Karl Marx refused to get a job. In fact, work seemed to make him ill.
In the summer of 1851, when starting his regular column for the New York Daily Tribune, he fell ill immediately and begged Engels to take over. A few months later, when asked for a contribution to Vendemeyer's newspaper Die Revolution, he took to his bed for a week.
Well, laziness has its consequences. Shortly after her first birthday in 1852, Franziska died after an attack of bronchitis. Clearly a strong and happy family life. They couldn't afford the cost of an undertaker, so just left the corpse in their back room, while the family and maid slept on the floor in another. Only when a generous French neighbour lent them £2 did they finally bury the child.
The landlady has really put me in a state of terror. She has already had our belongings auctioned off, and in addition, baker, governess, tea grocer, and the terrible man, the butcher. I am in a state, Karl. I no longer know what to do. For all these people, I am exposed as a liar." Karl Marx had placed his wife in a state of terror over money and property, just as his writings and ideology would do to countless millions in the centuries ahead. Jenny's illnesses were both physical and psychological. Living in Dean Street caused repeated bouts of bronchitis, which led her frequently to retire to bed. But she was also prone to what was referred to as nervous excitement. Her maladies were as much the product of depression or despair as of physical illness. Remedies again generally involved the use of alcohol. "My wife is ill. Little Jenny is ill. The maid has some sort of nervous fever. I could not and cannot call the doctor because I have no money to buy medicine. For the past 8 to 10 days, I have been feeding the family solely on bread and potatoes. But whether I shall be able to get hold of any today is doubtful, because I'm too bone idle to get a job."
I wish I could sit here all day reading all the letters that Marx fired off to Engels and others, describing their terrible conditions, begging for money, and detailing how they were frequently selling or lending their meagre possessions just to avoid having to get a job. But we'll be here all day. I will give a brief snippet though. One day in April 1853, a baker knocked on the door to tell them that he wouldn't be delivering any more bread until Marx paid his outstanding bills. In September 1853, Marx described how he was having to pay out 25% of his household income at the YouTube censorship shop. In 1855, a doctor was pursuing him for unpaid medical bills dating back to the previous year.
There was a most humiliating reminder of how far they had sunk when he was arrested while trying to bond Jenny's Argyle family silver. The police suspecting, reasonably enough, that a scruffy German refugee couldn't have acquired these ducal heirlooms legitimately. Marx spent a night in the cells before Jenny managed to convince them of her aristocratic bona fides. However, it really doesn't make sense where all the money he got was going. Even in 1851, one of Marx's most poverty-stricken years, he received at least £150 from Engels and other supporters, a sum on which a lower middle-class family could live in some comfort. From 1852 onwards, he had an income of at least £200. The annual rent for Dean Street was only £22. Why, then, was he always so catastrophically broke?
The reason why is simple. He was an immature idiot. Francis Veen says it's because he tried to keep up appearances by doing things like hiring a secretary, even though his wife was willing to do the job. Yes, because he was an immature idiot that doesn't understand how money actually works. He never got a real job because he had parental issues and a religious altruistic philosophy that justified his bone idleness. And despite the fact that some of my viewers are blind to the pattern identified in my other video on the various socialist leaders, it's clear from his behaviour with his parents that this was a factor.
Karl scarcely ever replied to his parents' letters. He never inquired after their health. He had spent almost 700 thalers of their money in 1 year, whereas the richest spend less than 500. He had weakened his mind and body chasing abstractions and giving birth to monsters. He never returned home during university holidays and ignored the existence of his brothers and sisters. The truth was that Marx had left his family behind.
This is evidence that he was ashamed of his origins and heritage, but also an indication of a poor upbringing, altruistic indoctrination, and a bad relationship with his parents and siblings. We don't have a lot of evidence about his early upbringing, but from the evidence we do have, it's clear that this must have been the case. Otherwise, why would he abandon his family like that?
Marx's determined efforts to cut loose from the influence of his family, religion, class, and nationality were never wholly successful. As a venerable greybeard, he remained forever the prodigal son, firing off begging letters to rich uncles or ingratiating himself with distant cousins who might soon be drawing up their wills.
He kept a maid even though he barely had enough money to keep her or his wife. And he had massive arguments with his wife over their financial situation, but even she couldn't shake Marx from his idleness. And without a hint of irony, he complained that his fellow socialists weren't working.
I wish some of our lads in London would really settle down to a more or less steady job, for they're becoming inveterate loafers.
Now, we've got to ask ourselves how he could possibly write this. Well, one of the sympathetic biographers, Jones, says that the dozen or so members of the Communist Party, or rather the group of communists that had gathered around Marx because no formal party existed at this time, had committed themselves from 1852 onwards to keeping the Marx family financially afloat. So this would explain why he was complaining that the other socialists weren't working, because the more they worked, the more money there would be in the pot for him to leech off. But unfortunately, Jones doesn't explain the motivation behind this. Why would these people work hard and then give their hard-earned money to people too lazy to get a job and support themselves, but who also increasingly have more children and live beyond their means? Well, I was going to do a whole piece on why people advocate for a welfare state, but it would take too long, so I'm just going to quickly summarise it.
I found this article at the People's Policy Report, and the images there pretty much sum it up. In the altruist worldview, everybody needs to be equal. So even though Karl Marx chose not to work, chose to have a wife who didn't work, chose to have loads of children, chose to have a maid, and chose to live beyond his means, it's only fair that everybody else has to give him money.
We've all got to be equal. And if the goal is to live in this wonderful world without poverty, without inequality, where we're all on the same level, then it makes sense that those who work harder, earn more, and achieve more should have their excess blood, sweat, and tears taken from them and given to those who are less fortunate. We don't want to see children suffer. We don't want to see the disabled starve to death. We don't want to see a racial minority get discriminated against. And so we need to equalise everything. We can't have one person have more than someone else, because that means that someone else is being victimised. Well, there's many arguments against this, many of which I can't get into here, but even on a micro level we can see this doctrine doesn't work. Karl Marx is too lazy to get a job, doesn't have a steady income, yet continues to get his wife and his maid pregnant, lives beyond his means, and takes zero responsibility for the life he's chosen for himself. His choices that he is making put him into this position, yet it's everybody else's responsibility to pick up the pieces. So the other socialists, being good little altruists, are taken for a ride by this complete and utter scumbag. And his entire ideology is geared towards shaming everybody else and playing upon their altruistic hearts so that he can reap the benefits. It's fantastic that he managed to trick so many people. But he only had a dozen or so rich followers, and that wasn't enough to sustain his lavish lifestyle. So, being so poverty-stricken and in debt, Karl and Jenny Marx resorted to desperate measures, which is a new euphemism for conceiving a new child, Eleanor Marx, born in January 1855. Marx was disappointed that she was a girl, since women couldn't expect to earn a living and his finances weren't in great shape. Yep, that's right. Marx was hoping for a male child so that he could send him to work for him.
I prefer the male sex among children who will be born at this turning point in history. These Marx opinions ought to receive full-throated condemnation by feminist Marxists and leftists of all stripes, who would not tolerate them if espoused by a prominent conservative thinker.
The entire family became ill in March 1855, and I'm not a doctor, but I think I know why they were constantly ill. A Prussian spy described what he saw.
When you enter Marx's room, smoke from the coal and fumes from the tobacco make your eyes water, so much that for a moment you seem to be groping about in a cavern. But gradually, as you grow accustomed to the fog, you can make out certain objects which distinguish themselves from the surrounding haze. Everything is dirty and covered with dust, so that to sit down becomes a thoroughly dangerous business.
Bearing in mind that Marx himself had always had a bad chest, and his parents and siblings all had bad chests, as well as other ailments, so it should have been obvious to him that his children might also suffer from a similar condition, especially when they showed him the symptoms. But no, he continued to smoke inside the flat. Well, your actions have consequences. Marx's only surviving son, Edgar, died of tuberculosis aged 8 in his father's arms as the church bells were ringing for Good Friday. This time they could afford the funeral, which was attended by Wilhelm Liebknecht, another lifelong friend of Marx's, who would go on to found the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, in the 1860s. Liebknecht tried to comfort Marx, who was distraught, and when it looked as though Karl might throw himself into the grave after his son, Liebknecht had to stick out a restraining arm to stop him. But the devastation was accompanied by some good news. One of his wife's uncles had died, plus her mother, and Jenny received £220 in inheritance by 1856. This allowed them to move out of Soho to 9 Grafton Terrace, which had 8 small rooms on 4 floors, but was £36 a year in rent. That's right, more expensive than the previous place. Jenny redeemed some of her possessions currently in the censorship shop and furnished the place for £40 before becoming pregnant once more. This was her 7th pregnancy, and Marx still didn't have a job. Living in this wonderful magic castle, as Jenny called it, it should be no surprise at all that they soon ran out of money again, which Marx admitted to Engels in January 1857.
So here I am, without any prospects and with growing domestic liabilities, completely stranded in a house into which I have put what little cash I possessed, and where it is impossible to scrape along from day to day as we did in Dean Street. I am utterly at a loss what to do, being indeed in a more desperate situation than 5 years ago. Get a job!
It was later admitted that it was during this year, 1857, that Marx employed a second maid, the half-sister of the original maid. I say later admitted because he kept it quiet until she died. So he was utterly at a loss of what to do, yet decided to increase his expenses even further. What a moron. And it's no wonder that Jenny had, by this point, been medicating on alcohol on the orders of her doctors. She was drinking brandy, claret and port at various times, and sometimes probably also not on the doctor's orders, since Marx reported that she was dosing herself continually in December 1856. This means that she was definitely drinking while she was pregnant. Her 2-year-old daughter, Eleanor Marx, was popular with the neighbourhood kids and earned the nickname Tussie, which rhymed with a word for a cat beginning with the letter Papa, right? A Tussie cat. So she was called Tussie, and because she was popular, the rest of the family became known as the Tussies, which is a very good way of describing Marxists.
The concept of self-alienation was drummed into Marx's children from infancy, mainly through the fairy stories which he invented to amuse them, confirming that altruism breeds self-hatred. Of the many wonderful tales he told me, the most wonderful, the most delightful one was Hans Röckler. It went on for months and months. It was a whole series of stories. Hans Röckler himself was a Hoffman-like magician who kept a toy shop and who was always hard up. His shop was full of the most wonderful things, of wooden men and women, giants and dwarfs, kings and queens, workmen and masters, animals and birds as numerous as Noah got onto the ark, tables and chairs, carriages, boxes of all sorts and sizes. And though he was a magician, Hans could never meet his obligations either to the devil or the butcher, and was therefore, much against the grain, constantly obliged to sell his toys to the devil. These then went through wonderful adventures, always ending in a return to Hans Röckler's shop. This is where the idea for Toy Story came from.
His fairy tales were just like his economics, completely divorced from reality. Notice how as soon as they ran out of money and was having to sell her toys to the devil, he was telling his daughter that they would come back to her at a future date. This was probably true since they were going to the censorship shop. And obviously Hans Röckler is just a stand-in for Karl Marx himself. Marx is the mooching magician who expected money to just appear before him without having to work for it. Well, the magician's spells seem to have been cursed. On the 7th of July 1857, Jenny's new baby came out stillborn. Marx reported that Jenny was a nervous wreck and they were constantly in arguments. The mood in the flat was described as unpleasant, and he admitted to Engels that his abstract thinking was no longer a match for their domestic miseries. The doctor considered the possibility that Jenny had brain fever and recommended that she be sent to a seaside resort for recovery. Obviously, modern medicine is a lot more advanced these days, so we can confidently say it wasn't brain fever, it was a clear case of communism. And just like communism, things only got worse. Marx had been publishing 2 articles a week for the Daily Tribune newspaper, but he soon noticed that they were publishing fewer and fewer articles. He only got paid when they published his articles, and so he was starting to receive less and less money. Well, to combat this, he did what any good socialist would do. He went on strike. That's right, he went on strike. They were publishing fewer and fewer of his articles, and he went on strike. Does that make any sense? Of course not. Clearly, they didn't want to publish what he had to write, and going on strike wasn't going to work. So, the compromise they reached put him in an even worse position. They would pay Marx for only 1 column a week, whether or not it was published. So his income, as puny as it was therefore halved. To me, this just shows how completely clueless Karl Marx was when it came to basic economics. But he did manage to make up the difference by publishing in a cyclopedia, so he was back to where he was income-wise, which, as we said, wasn't enough. The exact amount may not have been this, but he had roughly £208 coming in per year from his articles, plus whatever his friends and family gave him, plus Engels' salary. Yet he couldn't afford to pay the £36 a year rent, and was slipping back into poverty. Again, it just makes no sense. Marx was essentially a freelance journalist. It could be argued that this meant that he did have a job. But hold your horses. It turns out that any amount of work seemed to make him ill. He was out for 3 weeks with liver trouble when he first signed onto the Cyclopedia, and in 1858, when another deadline loomed for his economic manuscript Das Kapital, he was so ill that he couldn't even write a letter to Engels. In fact, Jenny wrote it instead.
The worsening of his condition is largely attributable to mental unrest and agitation, which now, of course, after the conclusion of the contract with the publisher, are greater than ever and increasing daily, since he finds it impossible to bring the thing to a close.
Jones says that of the 67 articles published in the Cyclopedia, 51 of them were actually written by Engels. Francis Veen also says that maybe half of the articles submitted to the Tribune newspaper by Marx were also written by Engels. So, to say that his job was freelance journalism isn't entirely true, since he didn't really work it. Plus, his income wasn't enough to sustain his lifestyle, so the argument is that getting a regular job would have been the better option. And if he's skipping work like this, is it any wonder that there was some doubt that Marx would ever finish Das Kapital? In 1845, Marx claimed that he had nearly finished his treatise on political economy, Das Kapital Volume 1, and in 1846 he said it was about 4 months away from being completed. In 1852 he told Engels that this book would be completed in about 5 weeks, and now in 1858 he was still making excuses. He kept pushing back the release date, and his friends became more and more eager to see it, since if it took this long for Marx to write it, it must be good. Well, it took him another 15 years to write Das Kapital Volume 1, a book that is long, inaccessible, confusing, anti-Semitic, and totally wrong about economics, since it's based on the labour theory of value, which was rendered obsolete a few years later by the subjective theory of value. All the while, Marx's family suffered.
Eleanor went down with whooping cough, Jenny was a nervous wreck, the butcher, the censor broker, and the tallyman were all clamouring for payment. I don't suppose anyone has ever written about money when so short of the stuff. Wow. What a fantastic quote. That's right, Karl Marx. Penniless beggars don't know how money actually works. It is so ironic that communists and socialists blast the wealthy for being allegedly obsessed with money and material things, when in fact communists and socialists are obsessed with money and material things. That's because they have no money or property and are incapable of accumulating them, since they don't know how to contribute to the world.
When it got to the Christmas of 1858, the publishers were demanding the finished book immediately. Well, rather than deliver Das Kapital, Karl Marx submitted a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, which is basically the first chapter of Das Kapital, and it was largely seen as a flop, although it is still considered to be the true beginning of Das Kapital, as Marx himself said in the preface to Das Kapital.
The work, the first volume of which I now submit to the public, forms the continuation of my contribution to the Criticism of Political Economy, published in 1859. The long pause between the first part and the continuation is due to an illness of many years' duration that again and again interrupted my work. The substance of that earlier work is summarised in the first 3 chapters of this volume.
But he lied. He lied in the first few sentences of his magnum opus. It wasn't because he had been ill or interrupted. It was because he was lazy, which is not an illness. Yes, he was distracted by feuds, like with Karl Vogt, but that was entirely due to his procrastination. The economic notebooks lay unopened on his desk for months and years.
Today, the only thing remembered about the critique is the preface, 5 pages introducing a strange book lacking a last chapter and without a conclusion. Whether because of illness, penury, or the parlous state of family relations, Karl's judgment at this time was increasingly disordered, perhaps even touched by delusion, with mood changes ranging from unreal euphoria through uncontrolled paranoia to fantasies of revenge. This deluded mind was the same one that wrote Das Kapital, and yet people continue to trust what this person said. It truly boggles the mind. And why was Karl Marx so upset with Karl Vogt? Because Vogt denounced Marx as a charlatan who sponged up the workers while consorting with the aristocracy. And this was absolutely true. Karl Marx was a hypocrite. He hated the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy, yet was a member of the bourgeoisie and had married an aristocrat. He hardly did any work and relied on handouts from his harder working friends and family. I regret that this man, with his fine intellect, is lacking in the nobility of soul. I am convinced that the most dangerous personal ambition has eaten away at all the good in him. He laughs at the fools who parrot his proletarian catechism, just as he laughs over the communists a la Village and over the bourgeoisie. The only people he respects are the aristocrats, the genuine ones who are well aware of it. In order to drive them from the government, he needs a source of strength, which he can only find in the proletariat. Accordingly, he has tailored his system to them. In spite of all his assurances to the contrary, and perhaps because of them, I took away with me the impression that the acquisition of personal power was the aim of all his endeavours.
And this man was right. Francis Veen comes to Karl Marx's defence, saying that the modern critics are wrong, it's just a blotchy caricature. He may have been married to an aristocrat, he may have been a member of the bourgeoisie, had friends in the bourgeoisie who he was constantly in league with and was sponging off, but, Veen says, he didn't like them. So Vogt was obviously wrong. But no, Karl Marx hated everyone, and the world as well. He was Epicurus and Hegel entwined, and he was right to laugh at the fools who parrot his religious doctrines, which only appear to support the downtrodden when in fact they create them. Karl Marx deliberately designed a philosophy that was the opposite of life itself. It was against work, against productivity, against profit and success, against personal achievement, and against the producers of society. By deliberately enacting policies that reduce living standards, you can then claim that the system isn't working, and that if only you put Karl Marx in charge, we could have a system where Marx could be free to wander around aimlessly in life. He's selling you the rug that he's pulled out from under you. Well, exposed for the fraud that he was, the gloves came off. Marx tried to sue Karl Vogt, but failed, then wrote hit piece after hit piece against him and anyone who sided with him, just like the other Marx holes do today. It was during this tirade that he then attacked the editor of the Daily Telegraph, Joseph Moses Levy, who he said had a big Jewish nose.
The Weekly Mail maintains that although Levy really fools no one, he has changed I into Y. And it is true that among the 22,000 Levites whom Moses counted in the journey through the wilderness, there was not a single Levi who spelled his name with a Y. Just as Edard Simon spares no one to be regarded as belonging to the Romance people, so Levy is determined to be an Anglo-Saxon. Therefore, at least once a month he attacks the un-English policies of Mr. Disraeli. For Disraeli, the Asiatic mystery, is unlike the Telegraph, not an Anglo-Saxon by descent. But what does it profit Levy to attack Mr. Disraeli and to change I into Y, when Mother Nature has inscribed his origins in the clearest possible way right in the middle of his face? The nose of the mysterious stranger of Slacking Burgess, see Tristram Shandy, who had got the finest nose from the promontory of noses, was just a 9 days wonder in Strasbourg, whereas Levy's nose provides conversation throughout the year in the city of London.
Jenny and Engels praised this book and this passage, as does Marxist.org, describing it as one of the most brilliant of Marx's writings. That should indicate where their true nature lies. Even Francis Veen has to admit that this was rich coming from a man whose ancestors were rabbis called Levy, and ultimately it was little more than both a massive flop and a distraction from Das Kapital. Jenny had succumbed to smallpox, and the children were distraught at Christmas as their mother looked terrible. Marx struggled to pay for her medical bills and was himself off work for more than a month with worry, not that he did any work anyway. Then, in 1861, Marx spent a month with Ferdinand de Lassalle and his countess wife in Berlin. So, for context, Lassalle got involved with a countess who fought a divorce action against her husband. Lasala spent 10 years fighting her case, including bribing witnesses and stealing documents, and eventually won it. His share of the spoils set him up for life, and he bought a palatial Berlin residence. His box at the opera was next to the king's, and Bismarck himself came to pay homage. Lasala was described as a tyrant-in-waiting, a dangerous megalomaniac who would happily trample on the workers and form alliances with Prussian absolutism in his feverish quest for power. Of course, Francis Veen dismisses this accurate description of Lasala because the evidence be damned, apparently. Well, Marx spent his time with Lasala, going to a ballet and sitting in a private box next to King Wilhelm I of Prussia. Now, Marx didn't enjoy this trip, which he only went on because he wanted to reapply for German citizenship, but the point is that it shows just how close Marx was to the establishment. He may have been in exile and he may have been in poverty, but both of those things were his own doing. Had he been anything else other than a complete waste of space, he would have been in the highest rungs of society. So it's ironic that he was one of the biggest critics of high society, which is obviously coming from a place of envy, jealousy and self-hatred, perhaps even guilt, since he failed to maintain the life he was born into. It was during this trip that he wrote letters to Engels calling Lasala names behind his back, like the Jewish N-word. Yes, that's a quote. He called him the Jewish N-word. Francis Veen dismisses this as merely a harmless joke, but it isn't. Marx was deeply anti-Semitic, which is why he called the Jews the bourgeoisie. Anti-capitalism is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is anti-capitalism. Again, I've been over this, if only people would actually listen. Marx also visited his mother and his uncle, Lyon Phillips, receiving £160 in cash from him and the cancellation of his previous debts to her.
My mother does not want to hear a word about money, but she destroyed the IOUs that I made out to her. That is the only pleasant result of the 2 days I spent with her. He never thought to offer the 5 women, his mother and sisters, any help, but rather he expected his mother to continue to support him. She was hurt and eventually cut him off almost entirely, an offence for which he never forgave her. I wish Karl would accumulate capital instead of just writing about it. His wife said the same. Karl, if you had spent more time making capital instead of writing about it, we would have been better off.
Well, when he returned from his trip, he was broke again and bumming off Engels once more. Jenny would tell the landlord that Karl Marx was away on business and send him off empty-handed, while Marx himself cowered in his study. His daughter Jenny was described as weak and emaciated, which he excused as being from the strain and stigma of their circumstances, but an argument could be made for malnutrition based on the evidence. His wife, Jenny, told Karl Marx that she wished that she and her children were safely in their graves. Such was the depression she felt, and I wonder if she ever regretted her deliberate choice of marrying a scumbag.
Leading a dog's life is hardly worthwhile. Oh really? Did it take you until your mid-40s to realise this?
Since he had stayed with Lasala then came to visit Marx for a while, and Marx sold everything he had to try and maintain the illusion that he was doing better than he really was. Lasala ate and drank as if he was starving, hinting that the Marxist family diet was extremely modest, and boasted of losing a mere £100 on a stock market gamble. He then asked if Karl and Jenny would allow one of their teenage daughters to stay with him as a companion maidservant, paid of course. Marx complained to Engels, saying that this was an unspeakable disregard for their social status, but it's quite clear that Lasala was trolling Marx. When the landlady came knocking and threatening the bailiffs, Lasala finally offered £15 as a loan, and another £60, but he only handed that over once he had received a written guarantee by Engels. Marx accepted the money, but it ended in a heated argument which saw the two men end their friendship. Thanks to his own laziness and Lasala's trip, Marx was left nearly bankrupt, and his uncle and mother didn't help him at all. At Christmas 1862, Jenny tried to woo a French banker in hopes of getting money, but the trip was a disaster, and she returned home to learn that the maid's stepsister, their second maid, had died of a heart attack 2 hours earlier. The maid was distraught, and her husband was unable to pay the £7.10 funeral costs. And it was at this point that he admitted that he had actually had a second maid for the past 5 years. Well, after all these problems, something very strange happened. Marx finally realised what had gone wrong. Like his father, his wife, and others, during his trip, Lasala had chastised Marx for only knowing theory and not knowing anything practical. And for the first time in his entire life, this made Karl Marx think. It took him almost all of his life before he realised that he actually had to produce something of worth in order to earn money. A shocking revelation, I know. So, he actually did the unthinkable. He applied for a clerical job on the railways. He was 45 and applying for his first real job outside of journalism. Wow, stunning and brave. Of course, his handwriting was so bad that he was rejected, but at least he had tried. Now that he had tried once to get a job and had been rejected, that obviously meant that all doors were closed to him. So he never tried to get another job again. He didn't submit any more applications, he just tried the once, and that was it. Instead, he went on pub crawls and got into arguments with the local English proletariat, whom he despised, smashing street lanterns and running away from the police. Because what else is a benefit scrounger meant to do? Then, one of the women that Engels was with, Mary Burns, died suddenly in January 1863, aged 41. Engels was heartbroken, especially since he was simultaneously sleeping with her sister. When he told Karl Marx, Marx wrote back giving 2 sentences of condolences, and then spent the rest of the letter complaining about his own troubles. His children hadn't been to school since Christmas because he couldn't pay the bill, and their shoes were falling apart. This was seemingly more important to him than Engels, but he parted by saying that he wished his mother had died rather than Mary. Engels was obviously angry and had to stop himself from writing back for an entire week before finally giving in and firing back. He said that everyone else, including his Philistine acquaintances, had given him more sympathy than Karl Marx had done. Marx half-heartedly apologised, explaining that he was under extreme pressures, saying that he would soon have to declare bankruptcy and marry off his daughters, and that in such circumstances he could only afford cynicism, which is why his letter came off the way it did. As Francis Wien says, this was the only sincere apology Karl Marx ever gave to anyone in his life. But Jones says it was written more to frighten Engels into coughing up more money for him, and I agree, since it seemed to have worked.
This was the one instance in which Engels was so ticked at Marx that their relationship almost came to an end, but not quite. Friedrich would saunter back to continue fulfilling his role as Karl's top sap and sugar daddy. Engels served Marx as a kind of substitute mother, sending him pocket money, fussing over his health and continually reminding him not to neglect his studies. And as Engels' fortune grew, so did his generosity. But Marx always adjusted his standard of living to a level above what he received. Thus, he was never out of debt, and he never stopped asking Engels for more.
Engels was still fuming for Marx's words, but accepted his apology. then set about rescuing Karl Marx from destitution. Engels stole £100 from his family's company for Marx, then sent another £250 a few months later. Another friend bailed him out too, which meant he could now go on holiday. That's right, instead of paying down debts or whatever, Marx went on holiday. At this point, Marx's health was very bad, with boils on his feet and back. He responded to this by smoking twice as much as usual, taking a cocktail of pills and alcohol, despite liver issues, and he also took large doses of opium. Yep. Karl Marx, the moocher, who was in the process of writing Das Kapital, was on opium. Well, that certainly explains why it was so badly written. But I like how he's got massive financial troubles, yet is perfectly capable of funding his smoking, drinking and drug addictions. Obviously, such things take priority over the wealth and health of his wife and children. The man who said that religion was the opium of the masses ended up taking opium for his boils, as well as doses of arsenic. He and his doctors were perplexed at the cause of the boils, which was not a disease picked up by anyone else in the Marx household. Marx's obsession with not bathing would seem a rather obvious contributing factor. Finally, Karl Marx's mother died at the age of 75 on the 30th of November 1863, and he couldn't have been happier. Engels sent £10, and when Uncle Lion Phillips took back all the money that he had lent to Marx, this left Karl Marx with an inheritance of just over £100. And let me just ask you a question. Karl Marx was a jobless, deadbeat dad who was still massively in debt. The Marx holes were so near bankruptcy that they couldn't afford to live in their flat on Dean Street. So, with this windfall of a few £100, what do you think they did next? That's right. In 1864, they moved into a mansion. Could Karl Marx afford a mansion? Has real communism ever worked? No. And he admitted that he couldn't afford it to Engels, whom he was still borrowing money off. If you're looking on Google Maps for this place, it was where the brown plaque is. But it wasn't like this back in the day. It was a detached mansion with a large garden and enough bedrooms for each girl to have their own, plus Marx had his own study. This flat looks like it was made in the 70s or something. The rent was £65 a year, not including increased rates, which was an astronomical sum, nearly twice the expense of the previous place. And this would definitely have been a disaster had one of Marx's old devotees, Wilhelm Wolff, not died on the 9th of May 1864 and left Marx £820. This was far more than Marx had ever earned from his writing, and explains why the first volume of Capital, published 3 years later, carries the dedication to my unforgettable friend Wilhelm Wolff, rather than the more obvious and worthy candidate Friedrich Engels. They furnished the new mansion, bought 3 dogs, 2 cats and 2 birds, went on vacation, and Marx also returned to politics. Marx started to seriously work on Das Kapital, but it wasn't long before he fell back on hard times. For 2 months, I have been living solely on the chess piece shop, which means that a queue of creditors has been hammering on my door, becoming more and more unendurable every day. This fact won't come as any surprise to you when you consider 1. That I have been unable to earn a farthing the whole time, and 2. That merely paying off the debts and furnishing the house cost me something like £500. I myself found it unbelievable how the money disappeared. World famous economist, ladies and gentlemen. Marx also started to seriously work on Das Kapital, but let's not forget, a lot of what Marx wrote over the years weren't Marx's words. Engels was not only working a job at the family firm, partying like it was 1848, and bedding 2 women in a classic love triangle until one of them died, but he wrote a lot of Marx's articles for him. So doubt was placed on whether Karl Idle Marx would even finish Das Kapital. Well, for altruistic reasons, Engels continued to fund this addle plate. That's an interesting word for you. Not only did he think he had a duty to his friend, but he religiously thought that the revolution was just around the corner. So, what is the use of money if you think it's going to disappear tomorrow? So he spent 20 years working at the office, repeatedly predicting the revolution that never came, while sending money to Marx, and finally, in 1867, he got what he had wanted all that time. After 20 years, Karl Marx, aged 48, finished Das Kapital, Volume 1.
He wrote the last few pages of Volume 1 standing at his desk when an eruption of boils around the rump made sitting too painful. Engels' experienced eye immediately spotted certain passages in the text where the carbuncles have left their mark, and Marx agreed that the fever in his groin might have given the prose a rather livid hue. A carbuncle suddenly erupted, soon to be followed by two others. The last one was especially bad and obstinate, and furthermore was so awkwardly placed that it prevented him from walking or moving at all. This morning it has been bleeding more strongly, which has brought him some relief. 2 days ago we began the arsenic cure, of which Karl expects a good effect. It is really dreadful for him to be interrupted again in the completion of his book, and in his delirium at night he is forever talking of the various chapters going round and round in his mind.
After begging Engels for money to retrieve more items from the censor shop and for postage, Karl Marx submitted the manuscript to the publishers. His family was so poor at this time that they refused to respond to invitations for their children to go to other people's houses. But it was all worth it, right?
The first royalty check from the book arrived 16 years after it was published, at which point both Karl and Jenny had died. Only their surviving children got some royalties. I only got as far as page 2. That's where the footnote is nearly a page long. I felt that 2 sentences of the main text and a page of footnotes were too much. Wilson had a first-class degree in politics, philosophy and economics, but he guessed that his profession of ignorance would endear him to the educated middle classes, who, particularly in Britain and America, are often perversely proud of their refusal to engage with Marx.
Because it's a load of excrement. I have read it, it is deeply flawed. And I've not got time to go into it today, but I have done previously, and I can sum it up by saying that Marx's anti-capitalism is his anti-Semitism, which is why the title Das Kapital literally means, in his own words, the Jew. And according to Karl Marx, we've always had Jewish capitalism, since money and commodities have been in existence since the dawn of time, which is what he spends the first 100 or so pages telling us. Capital is money, capital is commodities, after all. So the ancient Greeks were capitalists then, weren't they? But Francis Fiend spends most of a chapter telling us how stupid people are for being incapable of reading the thing, dismissing almost all criticism as simply people unable to comprehend the godlike amazingness of the scripture written by a being so parasitic that he transcends the need to earn money itself. Marx and the Marxists are, in Fiend's view, no mere mortals like he says the rest of us are. This is why Fiend dismisses Karl Marx's anti-Semitism in chapter 11, refusing to recognise that it's actually fundamental to the doctrine. In reality though, Fiend is just echoing Engels, who said that in a post-Hegelian world, people just aren't used to this way of thinking. Marx himself admitted that the first chapter was the greatest difficulty. And as explained earlier, despite claiming to have a dialectic method opposite to Hegel's, it clearly wasn't. Most socialists and communists don't even bother reading Das Kapital, since even they know it's far too hard to read. They just stick to the Communist Manifesto, if even that. since in my dealings with them, they don't even seem to have read the 10 points of the Manifesto, nor grasped that we have actually implemented all of them in the current system. Even Marxist devotee Erich Hobsbawm admitted that Das Kapital's true purpose was to be so unreadable that people could claim to have read it and nobody else could call them out on it since they hadn't read it either.
Capital Volume 1 was indeed frequently reprinted, but it may be doubted whether it lent itself to wide popular reading. Many of those who bought it were probably content to have it on their shelf as a living proof that Marx proved the inevitability of socialism scientifically. Marx's boils might have been at their worst when he was writing Das Kapital, which might explain the sense of oozing pain one feels when reading this blistering piece of work.
Now, Marx was still living in obscurity at this point, until the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War. Due to the Paris Commune, the newspapers picked up on Marx's writings, like the Communist Manifesto, and used this to prove that the enemy was within. In reality, there was still only a handful of revolutionaries throughout Europe, which is why the writings of each one of them are pored over so thoroughly. Unlike today, where there's millions of lazy, unemployed philosophy graduates, back then there were only a handful. So as a result of Das Kapital and his notorious defence of the Paris Commune, Marx was propelled into infamy overnight. Still, he remained penniless, until Engels sold his partnership in the family firm, moved to London and was able to provide Marx a pension of £350 a year. By this point, his children were growing up and having children of their own, and they all became mentally ill, chain smokers or similar, since their father was a tyrant during their upbringing. In March 1875, they moved down the road to number 44 of the same street, which was a 4-storey terraced property and far cheaper than the mansion. But Marx's health was beginning to fade now, and the regular pub crawls slowed down. His wife Jenny was also coming to her end, with her health deteriorating from 1877 onwards due to liver cancer, probably from all the alcohol. She died in her sleep on the 2nd of December 1881. Marx was ill at this time, with Engels commenting that Marx was effectively dead. His doctor even forbade him from attending the funeral of his wife, and in January 1883 his daughter Jenny also died of cancer at age 38. And he was not long to follow.
Racked by laryngitis, bronchitis, insomnia and night sweats, he was too weak to read the Victorian novels which had often brought solace in such moments.
Downing a pint of milk daily, plus rum and brandy, it's no wonder he had been plagued with liver problems all his life. Well, on Wednesday, 14th of March 1883 at about 2:30 p.m, Karl Marx died in his armchair next to the fire and was discovered by one of his children and Engels. He had developed an ulcer on his lung which had ruptured. Again, that bad chest and constant smoking was what did him in. He was buried on the 17th of March with only 11 mourners attending the funeral, probably because he smelled so bad. His entire estate amounted to £250. Engels was loyal to the end, financially supporting Marx right up until his death, waiting patiently for the next volume of Das Kapital, only for Marx to have died before it was completed.
In the last 7 years of his life, Karl became increasingly secretive about his intellectual preoccupations. He stopped talking to Engels about his work, even though his friend had moved to London and now lived around the corner. In 1883, just after Karl's death, Engels was shocked to discover how little further work had been done on the second volume.
Engels therefore had to do it himself, which he did in 2 years, since he knew that nobody else was capable of reading Marx's terrible handwriting. He then published the third volume 9 years later after that, a year before his own death in 1895. This was 20 or 30 years after their original composition. Marx's treatment of his daughters is interesting because he denied them an education, denied them careers, and then was hostile to potential suitors. The two surviving daughters of Karl Marx ended their own lives, and only his son, Freddie, who was the only one not to live with his father, managed to live until the grand old age of 77 when he died a natural death in 1929.
In fact, 4 of Marx's 6 children died before he did, including his eldest daughter, Jenny. The 2 daughters who survived him later committed Sudoku. Actually, Tick, it's not Sudoku, it's Sep. Yes, I know it is. But I can't say that word either because it means the same thing as the word on the screen and will cause the video to be demonetized. So I'm using a substitute for the second word in order to get around the censorship of the 2 words. Welcome to the Google archipelago. Anyway, I think this next sentence sums up the man himself. Throughout his life, Marx appealed over and again for handouts from every friend or relative he could think of, even eventually one of his grown children.
The question then must be, why is it that Karl Marx's personal life is not known or ignored? Surely, if more people understood who this man actually was in reality, they would be more skeptical of his writings. Well, that's precisely what his followers thought, including those in the Social Democratic Party of Germany. They therefore schemed to increase Karl Marx's image to hide his flaws.
The cost of this approach was an increasing inflation of Marx's reputation. Ever more expansive claims were made about the scale and size of Marx's achievement, while areas in which his writings or activities had failed to meet these mythical requirements were glossed over or hidden. Marx was promoted as the philosopher who had accomplished as much in the human sciences as Darwin in the natural sciences. This invented parallel reinforced the claim that the Social Democratic Party embodied the science of socialism.
So, Karl Marx was granted a mythical status, which is why his personal life and half of his writings are completely ignored, while focus is given to the Communist Manifesto and a few hints in other works. Most adherents to the faith have not even read the Communist Manifesto, let alone Das Kapital, for if they had, they'd know we've already implemented all 10 points in the Communist Manifesto. This is already a socialist world. If only they would bother to read the manifesto, they would see that. We don't even use money anymore, just currency, which is not the same thing. But again, they haven't read Marx. The problem is that it is wrong to separate the author from the work. We are not blank slates, tabula rasa. We are human. And humans have minds that have personalities. To deny the personality inherent within human beings is to deny the work that they produce. Historians who are pretending that they're not putting their personality into their works are only lying to themselves and their readers. And I've made sure to insert my personality into this video as a deliberate policy so that you know exactly what my thoughts are. You can take them or leave them, but I'm not going to be dishonest and hide them from you. Well, Karl Marx was never kind to anyone and was often cruel. He didn't get along with people and was vicious with his rivals and supporters. Karl Marx was a slothful, greedy, bourgeois bigot who married an aristocrat and dragged her down into the gutter alongside him. His own children suffered the consequences of this indolent behaviour, and his friends were financially burdened by the strain of his colossal, unwashed and boil-ridden rear end. His economics wasn't economics, but gibberish nonsense that was immediately debunked after his death. And he wasn't even an economist, but a philosopher who could be described as a modern Epicurus, lazy and good for nothing. Worse, the world at large was infected by the disease of his philosophy, the philosophy that distorts our view of the world, diverts us from productivity, destroys our economy, and shames us if we believe in hard work and thrift, since, after all, if we don't feel guilty, we won't be willing to give money to parasites like Karl Marx who desperately need it, since they're incapable of work. Of course, being from the bourgeoisie and having married an aristocrat,
Marx longed to go back to the good old days where the peasants starved and the lords like him ruled over them. That's why his ideology was designed to enrich the elite, which he was a part of. He only claimed to be for the poor, when in fact he wasn't. It was an insidious lie, a dialectic. And it's a shame that the adherents to the Marxist faith are incapable of listening, for if they were, they'd realise that they have been tricked. Sadly, his ideology lingers like the corpse of his dead child in the back room he couldn't afford to pay the funeral expenses for, simply because adherents to the faith wish to claim that we haven't fully understood the anti-Semitic ravings of a bone-idle sponge. And it is curious why so many people take their monetary policies from a debt-ridden benefit scrounger who knows absolutely nothing about money. Yet, millions of people do, and you just try to get through to them. The Marx holes will no doubt be in the comments calling me a liar, whilst crying about the capitalist system for being unfair and not equal. And while I grant you that this current system is shockingly bad, and we desperately need a free market, not capitalism or socialism, every person who's made it this far into the video is perfectly capable of learning how to make money, and it is their responsibility to pull themselves out of the hole that they've put themselves in. Your life is your responsibility because nobody's coming to save you. You have to do the work to save yourself. So I will come to the same conclusion I did in my previous video on the socialists. Overall, it's clear that Karl Marx was brought up under the mainstream religion, instilling him with an altruistic morality. He lost the faith but kept the altruism, had a poor relationship with his parents, a rebellion against the father, and his schooling was obviously not helpful. This led to indolence, laziness, which clashed with reality, and resulted in Marx having a fear of independence, which is why he never got a job. Marx thought himself better than everyone else, and falling under the spell of a different altruist religion, an Orphic Hermetic Hegelianism, this manifested as a hatred of the current system. Socialism gave Marx permission and a drive to rebel against reality, which was a subconscious rebellion against the parents. Socialism also gave him an excuse not to work or earn an income, and fulfilled his desire to be taken care of. He expected everyone else to constantly help him out, since the right thing to do under the altruistic banner of equality is to support useless beggars like himself instead of letting them take responsibility for their poor choices in life. Spouting this philosophy to the world then led to disastrous consequences for humanity as a whole. And it's not a coincidence that the man who hated money and usury was also the same man who was too lazy to earn money and was constantly in debt. Marx hated reality because it required him to stop being a good-for-nothing scrounging scumbag who needed to get a job and take responsibility for his own life. That was too much effort for him, and so Karl Marx became an anti-capitalist to try and hide the fact that he was an abject failure of a human being. Thanks for watching, bye for now.